September 2000, the editors of Executive Intelligence Review magazine rushed to print with a special report titled, "Who is Sparking a Religious War in the Middle East?" The decision to go to print with material of crucial importance, documenting who were the assassins of the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and who were the forces behind the efforts to blow up the Middle East through a religious war that would last for decades, was brought on by the September 26th visit by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of two of the holiest places of Islam, accompanied by more than 1,000 Israeli police and soldiers. Sharon's provocative visit to the Temple Mount predictably sparked Palestinian protest demonstrations and an Israeli deadly force reaction. In a matter of weeks, 8 years of effort at achieving a meaningful peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians was down the drain, and as the result of that, the Barak government soon collapsed. On February 6, 2001, culminating that provocation, Ariel Sharon himself was elected Prime Minister of Israel by a 63% majority of the vote. This reflected a terrorization and literally a driving of a majority of Israelis so insane that they were willing to put the butcher of Lebanon, Ariel Sharon, for the first time in his long career, into the Prime Minister's office. It is no secret among analysts of the Middle East situation that the region is now on the verge of a new war, a regional war that would not last for 6 days or 6 weeks, but would engulf the entire region for years and would likely trigger an oil shock of far greater consequence than the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the oil shocks that followed after that. So the appropriate question that has been posed by Lyndon LaRouche in the context of these developments is, how can we avoid such a horrific war? The answer, which is documented in the pages of the EIR special report, is that the key players in the region, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the Israelis, have to begin the process of healing and peacemaking by recognizing that for decades, indeed for more than 150 years, they have been pawns of a British oligarchical strategic game to keep the Middle East inflamed, manipulated around religious and territorial passions, irrational, so that the British would have a war spark that could be triggered on a moment's notice for not just regional but global purposes. Indeed, following the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, a team of Executive Intelligence Review investigators conducted a year-long inquiry into the forces behind the Rabin assassination, which, like the recent Sharon provocation at the Temple Mount, was aimed at preventing the peace process from going forward at a crucial potential breakthrough moment. What we learned in the course of months of investigation, hundreds of interviews, more than 30 to 40 hours of taped interviews, is that a highly organized top-down structure was behind the assassination of Rabin and is today the string pullers behind the drive for a war in the Middle East through the imposition of Sharon in power in Israel and all that that represents. Among the leading figures responsible for these current unfolding developments are a network of high-level British Freemasonic operatives tied directly to the British royal family. Today, the titular head of the Grand Mother Lodge of British Freemasonry is the Duke of Kent, the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth. But as EIR investigators learned, particularly with respect to the Temple Mount project, the man who runs the day-to-day affairs of British Masonry on a worldwide scale, including in Jerusalem, is the Marquis of Northampton, who has been one of the leading architects of the Temple Mount project. The Marquis of Northampton's leading assistant is Professor Giulio Di Bernardo, who was installed as the Grand Master of Italian Special Masonry at a ceremony in 1995, which was attended by the Marquis of Northampton. In an interview with EIR, Di Bernardo blatantly said, and this is a quote, "A new utopia may be based on the Kabbalah. I see a utopia based on Jewish mysticism, but Jewish mysticism as a place, a material place, Solomon's temple. This is my intention. This is my will." Now, to ensure that the hands and feet inside Israel were put in place to manipulate the assault on the Islamic holy sites, an event that would trigger a religious war of unfathomable consequences. Many years ago, in 1967, immediately after the Israeli military occupied the entirety of the city of Jerusalem and surrounded the Temple Mount, Dr. Asher Kaufman was dispatched to Israel by the British Masonic circles, particularly the Quator Coronati Lodge of British Masonry. In an interview several years ago, Dr. Kaufman accounted for some of his activities around the Temple Mount project of the high levels of British Masonry.
I think I spent about 2 months investigating theoretically whether one could trust this piece of information from our ancient records, that the blood drained into the Kidron Valley. And when I was convinced, I came to the realization that perhaps this particular record called Tractate Midot meaning dimensions, the dimensions of the temple, that this would enable me to work out where the temple stood.
Joining Dr. Kaufman in Jerusalem on behalf of the highest levels of the British oligarchy and British Masonry was a Dutch anthropologist, Leen Ritmeyer, who was a personal employee of the Rothschild family and was likewise dispatched to Jerusalem to provide the, quote, academic cover for the continuing preparations for the assault on the Temple Mount that has now reached a frenzied point with Sharon's coming into power in Israel.
After having worked for several years with Professor Benjamin Mazar on the Temple Mount excavation as his field architect, I became interested in the historical development of the Temple Mount.
The British oligarchy's Temple Mount project would have been impossible to carry out were it not for the fact that the high-level anthropologists deployed to Jerusalem were immediately put in contact with fanatical Jewish fundamentalists who were equally committed to the idea of the blowing up of the Islamic sites at the Temple Mount and the building of the Third Temple as a prophetic religious event. Back in 1967, literally at the moment that Israel occupied the entirety of the city of Jerusalem, a young Israeli paratrooper named Gershom Solomon established a group called the Temple Mount Faithful, which to this day has played a pivotal role in attempting to create the conditions for the blowing up of the Islamic holy sites. Recently, Gershom Solomon staged one of many demonstrations outside of the Temple Mount.
We shall never give up, no on the Temple Mount, no on Jerusalem, and no the land of Israel. I want to say to all the world, the struggle of the Temple Mount and Eretz Israel faithful movement is a struggle of all the Jewish and the Israeli people, for this holy mountain, for this city Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and for the land of Israel. This struggle will continue and stronger. I want to say here two important facts. First of all, we are opening now a very important law struggle on the ownership of the Temple Mount. We will come and say everyone in the world, the Temple Mount belongs to the Jewish people by the will of God.
You'll hear right now directly from Gershom Solomon, the head of the Temple Mount faithful, that their patron, their supporter all along throughout this entire process has been none other than Ariel Sharon.
Now we continue all the other events. We shall go and read Megillat Eicha, we shall pray, we shall go to the other gates, we shall go to the house of Arik Sharon.
Gershom Solomon epitomizes the irrationalist religious fundamentalism that has gripped large numbers of people in Israel, particularly those in groups like the Temple Mount Faithful, the Gush Emunim, the settlers' movements in the occupied territories, who have been historically financed and politically protected by General Sharon.
Gershom Solomon, head of the group called the Temple Mount Faithful, who have the cornerstone and want to erect it on the Temple Mount and start the construction of the third temple. Gershom shared with us his vision from atop the western wall overlooking the Temple Mount.
You know, when I'm so close to the place, I feel that I am not here. I am in the clouds and inside the place. You know, I see the first temple, which King Solomon built it. I don't see the Dome of the Rock here. I see a strange thing here. I see the first temple, I see the second temple, and more than this, I see the third temple, which will be rebuilt in this place exactly, very soon, very close to our time. Maybe tomorrow, maybe after 1 week, but now, and you and I and all the generation will have the big privilege to come to this place in the original situation, the biblical situation, when the temple is here, and the temple will become again a center of Israel, a center of the redemption of the people of Israel, and then all the nations from all the world will come and pray as God said. My house will be a house of praying for all the nations in all the world.
The plot to blow up the Temple Mount, unfortunately, is not simply a project of a group of insane Jewish fundamentalist fanatics and some greater Israel operatives like the current Prime Minister Sharon. The mayor of Jerusalem, a historical close political ally of Sharon inside the Likud party, makes it very clear that he too is committed to the idea of the rebuilding of the third temple, no matter what the consequences are.
The whole world refers to it as the Temple Mount, and yet few people report to themselves what's the significance of the name. The significance is that that's where the Jewish temple was originally built. This is the most sacred place for 3,000 years of Jewish history.
There's yet a third element behind this Temple Mount insanity, and that element has grave domestic implications for the United States as well. Here in the U.S., there is a very extensive network of Christian fundamentalists whose theological center is the Dallas Theological Center in Dallas, Texas, and who are as fanatically devoted to the blowing up of the Temple Mount and the rebuilding of the Third Temple of Jerusalem as is Gershom Solomon and the Jewish fanatics that we've already seen. Countless videos and books and audio tapes have been produced by a proliferation of televangelist organizations in the United States advocating the building of the Third Temple, the blowing up of the Islamic holy sites, and in almost every instance, there is a full and complete acknowledgement that the consequences will likely be a hideous religious war that will engulf the Middle East for a long time to come and likely lead to World War III.
There's a great controversy over the Temple Mount area. Today, the Jews cannot go up on top of the Temple Mount area. They must worship below at the Wailing Wall. What a paradox. For 1967, when they liberated Eastern Jerusalem, they had the opportunity to take control of the Temple Mount area, but Moshe Dayan didn't do it. What a dilemma. Today, there's this tremendous desire to rebuild the third temple, but it's impossible. They just can't do it unless they risk World War III.
One of the most active of the Christian evangelicals in the United States, involved in raising funds and inciting others to join in this fanatical drive to blow up the Islamic sites in Jerusalem, is Randall Price, who's written a series of books and made a series of widely circulated videotapes advocating exactly this.
Scholars have different opinions concerning the location of the temple in Jerusalem. Archaeologists such as Dr. Dan Bahat, the director of the Western Wall tunnel excavations, and Dr. Meir Ben Dov, chief excavator of the southern wall at the Temple Mount, both place Solomon's first temple and Zerubbabel and Herod's second temple at the traditional western site on the Temple Mount. This is the site today occupied by the Islamic Dome of the Rock. Dr. Asher Kaufman, a physicist and longtime student of the temple, proposes an alternate location in the northeastern corner of the Temple Mount. While no one in Israel at present may agree on the precise place where the temple was built in the past, we know without a doubt when the temple will be built in the future. According to sacred scripture, the temple predicted by the prophet Ezekiel in the last 9 chapters of his book will be constructed in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Immense topographical changes will be necessary to accommodate this temple, which will be a mile square in dimension. The Bible presents an order of prophetic events that will climax with the building of this temple.
Price's mentor, and until recently the head of the Dallas Theological Seminary, is John Walvoord.
In Daniel 9, the prophet predicts the future of Israel, in particularly the last 7 years that lead up to the second coming of Christ. And in the covenant that is mentioned there is going to be a division of the 7 years into 2 halves, one a time of peace for 3.5 years, and then the time of the Great Tribulation. And in that, the Antichrist will take over the temple and take over and stop its sacrificial system, which had been begun by the Orthodox Jews, and will install the worship and service of himself.
Another of Walvoord's protégés, who is equally fanatical about the inevitability and desirability of sparking a fanatical religious war in the Middle East, is the famous televangelist Jerry Falwell.
There's general agreement among all the theologians today there will be a future temple in Jerusalem. We can only speculate at this time how that might come to pass. The Muslims revere the Dome of the Rock as a holy shrine to commemorate the place where Muhammad supposedly ascended into heaven. There's no way they will ever willingly give up that place. And the only reasonable option would seem to be that it might be destroyed by warfare or terrorism or natural disaster like this earthquake. And only then could the Jews presume to rebuild the temple on that spot. Even that attempt would certainly be met with armed resistance throughout the Muslim world. The current interest in rebuilding the temple, the first of its kind in the last 1,400 years, is of significant merit. Something momentous is happening in the Middle East today that will soon affect the destiny of our entire planet.
Another of the fanatical Temple Mount advocates here in the United States is the best-selling author Tim LaHaye, who has produced a series of novels all effectively centered around the final days, the Battle of Armageddon, and the mythology of the Temple Mount.
The temple is a most significant institution designed by God as a symbol of his concern to bring man to himself. During the tribulation period, as we show in our fiction series, it is an expression of rebellion against God when Antichrist goes in and desecrates the temple and blasphemes in the name of God and actually sets his image up and demands that people worship him or Satan indwelling him. And it forces us to face the fact that in every generation, people have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. Are you going to surrender your will to God, or are you going to do your own thing? It's our prayer you surrender yourself to God.
Now ask yourself, is Tim LaHaye's concept of God, of Christianity, of mission, your idea of God, Christianity, and mission? Is the objective of Christianity to actually start a horrible, murderous religious war over the Temple Mount? I think not. I think a clear idea of the notion of religion that's conveyed by the LaHayes and by the Falwells and by the Walfords and by the Gershon Solomons is probably an image that was best captured as a form of extreme irrationalism in an old Hollywood movie, Elmer Gantry. And ask yourself if this kind of howling dog concept of man in the living image of God is your notion of religion.
Repent with Sister Falconer! Let that man alone! Let him out! Go ahead, Mark, brother! Go right ahead, Mark! There he is! The devil! Out that devil out of this tent!
With the installation of Ariel Sharon as the Prime Minister of Israel, all of the major pieces have been put in place on the ground. As the EIR Special Report documents, this has been a systematic effort that's been underway since 1967. And in fact, at this point, the final training is underway for the temple priests who will be brought in to administer this final Temple Mount process after the enormous turmoil and real-world genocide is conducted, if these people are allowed to get away with this. The Ateret Kohanim, which is a yeshiva adjacent to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, is training the priests, is practicing the ritualistic animal sacrifices, and is preparing for the day that they can move into the temple after the blowing up of the Islamic holy sites.
At Ateret Kohanim, students are studying to be Kohanim, the priest, and Leviim, the Levite. The 8-year program of this school includes courses in the rites and regulations of the priesthood, known as the Order of the Sacrifices of the Temple, including those of the red heifer.
This insanity can and must be stopped. There's a tradition in Israel associated with the great German philosopher Moses Mendelssohn that was carried into the state of Israel through some of the ideas represented at his best moments by the former Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, an impulse towards economic development of the entire region, of the entire Middle East, the blossoming of a new oasis in which Jews and Arabs can successfully live side by side in sovereign nation states. But for that to happen, the first step must necessarily be for those people on the ground, in the region in particular, to wake up to the fact that they are pawns in an evil chess game that's being played from outside the region by those who would wish to see a clash of civilizations bring down all of humanity, destroy the nation-state system once and for all, and render what's left of the human race slaves to a London-centered oligarchy. Now, the purpose of the drafting and circulation of the EIR Special Report was to get the evidence out, the shocking evidence, to ensure that people do indeed wake up to what's going on before it's too late, before the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, are blown up and the world is faced with World War III. For more information about the EIR Special Report, you can call the toll-free number 888-347-3258. This is Jeff Steinberg for the LaRouche Connection. forces behind the efforts to blow up the Middle East through a religious war that would last for decades was brought on by the September 26th visit by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of two of the holiest places of Islam, accompanied by more than 1,000 Israeli police and soldiers. Sharon's provocative visit to the Temple Mount predictably sparked Palestinian protest demonstrations and an Israeli deadly force reaction. In a matter of weeks, 8 years of effort at achieving a meaningful peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians was down the drain, and as the result of that, the Barak government soon collapsed. On February 6, 2001, culminating that provocation, Ariel Sharon himself was elected Prime Minister of Israel by a 63% majority of the vote. This reflected a terrorization and literally a driving of a majority of Israelis so insane that they were willing to put the butcher of Lebanon, Ariel Sharon, for the first time in his long career, into the Prime Minister's office. It is no secret among analysts of the Middle East situation that the region is now on the verge of a new war, a regional war that would not last for 6 days or 6 weeks, but would engulf the entire region for years and would likely trigger an oil shock. In December 2000, the editors of Executive Intelligence Review magazine rushed to print with a special report titled, "Who is Sparking a Religious War in the Middle East?" The decision to go to print with material of crucial importance, documenting who were the assassins of the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and who were the inflamed, manipulated around religious and territorial passions, irrational, so that the British would have a war spark that could be triggered on a moment's notice for not just regional but global purposes. Indeed, following the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, a team of Executive Intelligence Review investigators conducted a year-long inquiry into the forces behind the Rabin assassination, which, like the recent Sharon provocation at the Temple Mount, was aimed at preventing the peace process from going forward at a crucial potential breakthrough moment. What we learned in the course of months of investigation of far greater consequence than the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the oil shocks that followed after that. So the appropriate question that has been posed by Lyndon LaRouche in the context of these developments is, how can we avoid such a horrific war? The answer, which is documented in the pages of the EIR special report, is that the key players in the region, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the Israelis, have to begin the process of healing and peacemaking by recognizing that for decades, indeed for more than 150 years, they have been pawns of a British oligarchical strategic game to keep the Middle East